Hey, Red Clay Rambler fans, this year we're celebrating 10 years of the podcast. We just launched a fund drive, and I need your help to support this upcoming season. If you're able, please visit talesofaredclayrambler.com/donate to make your pledge through our PayPal portal. You can also become a patron on Patreon, which gives you access to perks like the Tales from the Vault podcast feed, which features remastered episodes that are no longer available. You can sign up for that at patreon.com/redclayrambler. We have brand new 10-year anniversary merch, including t-shirts, enameled pins, and a beautifully designed poster that are up for grabs when you make your pledge today. As always, thanks for listening, and let's get on with the show. Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. All right. Well, welcome to the 426th episode of the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler. As you guys can tell, people are still filtering in, so welcome everyone that's coming. We're going to start off doing trivia because we thought that'd be a good way to get people involved with, or at least the audience involved with the show. And then we're going to move into some questions that I have for Carole Epp and Britta Schroeder, who are my co-hosts and interviewees for the evening. So, to get started, we're going to start with a somewhat easy question. Well, easy maybe, which is, where does the podcast name come from? Any guesses? This is good. I'm stumping you from the get-go.
I was going to say, Ben, you started off with a hard one.
Well, I'm going to give you the answer. And I should say, let's sweeten the pot here. We got to make this like trivia that someone wants to win. So what's up for grabs is that you can win this pot today. So
I'll make up an answer.
He already said we can't answer Carole.
Oh,
yeah. Britta and Carole might know more answers than other people. So, and then you can also win a t-shirt, and you can also win some other things. So this is trivia, but you're going to keep your own score. So at the end of this, if you feel like you've gotten a bunch right, then you get to win. So Adam, I think, has an answer. Adam, how do you think the name came about? Is it a Grateful Dead reference? That's from Adam Field. That is a very good guess. That is not the right guess, but that is a very good guess. You're on the right path, though. It comes from a couple different places, and I guess I've never said this on the podcast, but where I'm from in Southwest Virginia, there's red clay everywhere. Like if you go out and try to put up a fence post, you're going to hit red clay. So part of it is that. Like I grew up in Salem, Virginia, where we had our own brick factory. So red clay is just everywhere. But I'm also borrowing the name from the Red Clay Ramblers, which is, Rebecca Harvey just put it in there, the string band that started in the 70s, and they're still playing today. And if you look them up, they have many, many, many different albums, and they've actually won a Tony. They've done a lot of work with theater as well, doing arrangements for theater. So definitely check them out. They're called the Red Clay Ramblers. So we're going to transition away from trivia, and now I'm going to talk to Carole and Britta. And you guys, the questions that we talk about, you guys are welcome to put answers to in the chat. Feel free to keep things rolling in the chat. And if you haven't introduced yourself in the chat, also feel free to do that and then tell us where you're from. So Britta and Carole, do you guys have a favorite episode? And if so, what is that favorite episode?
I think my favorite episode is with Diana Fate. And the reason why would just be that it kind of ties into why I love the podcast so much. I'm self-taught, and I had to go find all of my ceramic education by myself. You know, I didn't have any formal classes. And the podcast has really directed me. It's given me a path to go find people, to, you know, learn more about our community. There's so much online, but it can just be overwhelming to try to narrow that down, especially as a beginner who doesn't really know where to look. And I've used your podcast to give me that direction. And I loved Diana's episode so much. I realized when I was listening to it that I had pinned a bunch of her pots on Pinterest, you know, recognized the name, and then loved hearing her talk about her work. And I ended up going and taking a couple of workshops from her virtually. And she has profoundly changed my work. She taught me how to do the inlay treatment that I do on my work. And she was just such a wonderful source for me. She's an amazing person. I will start to get teary if I talk about it too much. I absolutely adore her. She's still my favorite potter. And that was, I mean, it's really affected me personally just from listening to that and then going down that path and following her.
Yeah, she's great. I mean, what an amazing maker. When I first saw her work, it was really, I think it was the refined pots that eventually were sold by Anthropology, right? Wasn't that who she was working with? Yeah. And I saw that. But then when I went to her studio to interview her in the Bay Area, and I saw so many pots that had a different feeling, same graphic language, but they were a little bit looser. They were just amazingly executed. Like her ability to draw, it was like it humbled me just seeing like her ability to draw on pots. So that's a great episode.
Well, she actually, before I took her class, I hadn't been doing my own drawings because I felt like I couldn't draw. And I had been telling myself that for a really long time. And she was just like, sure you can, you know, gave me a lot of good encouragement. She didn't just say, sure you can. She said something probably like wise and wonderful, but she encouraged me to start drawing. And now all of my stuff is my own drawings. And it's made a big difference, I think.
So how about you, Carole?
Well, I gotta admit, Diana is one of the best. She's one of the queens of the clay community. So definitely a good episode. But I am one of those people that is like, what's your top favorite bands? What's your favorite dessert? I can't pick. And so I'm not gonna. It's just not something that I do. And I think why that is, though, is that it's also, I look at your podcast and I look at all of the people that you've interviewed over the years. And I've been lucky enough to know some of those people very with friendships beyond acquaintances and stuff. And I think that there's so many episodes on there that have really given me beautiful insight to the human beings that I work with and I'm, you know, collaborate with, that I don't know, there's something really special about getting to know people that you do workshops with, or that you write an article with, or whatever, on these different levels. And I think your podcast has done that for me, for so many people. And then there's people like Clint Neufeld, right, who lives 20 minutes north of me and who is this fabulous artist, but also this like, he'll admit it, he's a grumpy guy, right? But then like you pulled so much out of him where it's like, I've known him for years, and what he told you, you know, I was like, oh my gosh, you got so much out of him, right? So if I learn through just about everything. So yeah, there's no very specific one, but I'm definitely the type of person that when I'm listening to the podcast, and I kind of hate listening to it in the studio because every episode seems to have at least one little section that's kind of life-changing, right? Where you're like, oh, pause and write this down, and your hands are covered in mud. And so I'm constantly looking at like the time, and it's like 30 minutes in and 49 seconds, right? And like go back to that so I can write down these notes later, because I feel like everybody you've chosen to interview has these like nuggets, right? These beautiful nuggets of wisdom that have overall, like all of those things have changed my practice, not just one person, but just that insight into everybody and how they think and how they make. So yeah, I totally cheated and didn't pick one.
That's totally fine. I think ceramic artists are so generous with their time and their emotional and intellectual space that it makes my job so easy. Like I think if I did a podcast that was, I'm trying to think of some, like if I was talking to lawyers, even though they talk all day, every day, I don't think that I don't think that style of communication would be as easy to talk to people as ceramic artists who are always, in my opinion, thinking about communication. I mean, that's kind of what we're doing, is communicating through clay and through three-dimensional language. So I feel fortunate. I just got lucky that I started a podcast with people that are so open. And that was kind of part of the Takeshi Yasuda story I was talking about earlier, is that I never thought that someone like him, or Warren McKenzie, or Julia Galloway, someone like that, would want to just sit and talk about their lives. So I agree. That I was thinking, what is my favorite episode? And I have tried and tried and tried to even get it down to 10. And I think I probably have like a top 50 maybe, because there's 420 something. But I can tell you the feeling I like is when both of us, the people I'm talking to and myself, are slightly confused, and then we find a way out of it. So, for instance, I was talking to Michael Simon before he passed. This was 2017, and that was a really significant interview because I've always looked up to him. He's all of my favorite potters' favorite potter. So when I was talking to him, the interview started off really weird, and that I was talking with his wife and him, and I had come up with this whole plan, and I think I'd even written down questions. I mean, I was being a good little reporter, and I was showing up. And before we actually got on the interview, his wife was like, "I don't think you understand his work." And then we started the interview. So I was like, "Oh God, do I understand all this preparation I had done in advance? Do I understand this icon of ceramics, his work?" And the answer,
how do you even go forward with that when somebody says that to you?
Well, I just gave up, and that's what made it a good interview.
Oh, nice.
Gave up in a positive way. You know, like I surrendered to the idea that I didn't have to know. I just had to be present with him in that moment. And that was such a great experience because he also talks in amazing sound bites. Like I think there's many recordings of him either from conferences or other things. He just could put his wisdom into language in a way that a lot of people couldn't. So I was sitting there, I was nervous, and we just start talking. And at some point, throughout this interview, he reaches over, and I think I have a picture of this somewhere. And there's this water pitcher where he had broken his own pitcher, and he had glued the handle of this pitcher back on. And we started talking like, why did you fix your own pot? And it wasn't fixed like in a kintsugi, amazing craftsmanship way. It was like I think he'd PC7'd it back on, or PC11. And I asked him like, why did you do this? And he started talking about how he loved this form. He basically, in 30 seconds, wrote a love story to this pot in a way that I've just never heard anyone say. And I happened to snap a photo of him at that moment. And I didn't get it on the recording, though. So one of the reasons I played the photos at the beginning of this episode is that sometimes the best stuff happens when the microphone gets turned off. And I think, Carole, you've probably experienced this with your podcast. Like, people open up as soon as you turn it off.
It's like a complete and utter switch. And all of a sudden and it's not that what they were saying before wasn't incredible, but as soon as somebody's relaxed, everything just flows so beautifully. I feel like you should just do these. I would love all of those stories that you have, Ben, from all the people that you've interviewed, like having you, when you leave those interviews, just doing a recording. Like, how much would the rest of us get from that if you just sort of did like even a 10-minute follow-up from each of those interviews, right? Because those are beautiful stories. And I think you've brought, it's like therapy for a lot of people when they get to sit down and talk about their lives in that way. And you facilitate that incredibly well. But yeah, I mean, you're getting those extra little nuggets that are so beautiful. And there's a lot of trust there. I mean, I think there's always a lot of trust. You really, I don't know, lots of skill there, Ben. Sorry, I'm just going to wax poetically about you because that's what we're here for.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the compliment. I did not want this to be all you guys telling me how great the podcast is. What I want this to be is that we talk about how amazing the clay community is. and this is something that Carole and I have talked about, and probably Britta and I as well, just that there's an accessible quality to the heroes in the clay world that is just not in other places. So you talked about Diana, and even talking about Clint, like Clint Neufeld, we should circle back to him. One of the most amazing slipcasters that I've ever seen. He slipcast full scale F-150 engine, like a full-size truck engine, slipcast it with parts that some of the parts even like relate like mechanical parts. And then he suspended them in a gallery. This was just one piece. Like, he's had a whole career of doing stuff like this. But he's just making, not quietly, but making diligently in his studio outside of Saskatoon. I mean, what a gem of a person. I mean, I'm so glad that I got to talk to him and try to get some of that knowledge out of him.
Yeah, he's worth coming back to talk to again. He does a lot more collaborative work with other artists. Like Rebecca Belmore has worked with him now, and he's also that generous person within the clay community too, that helps other artists who aren't necessarily versed in clay to see, projects through. So yeah. You've picked lots of good people over the years to interview. I mean, I don't think there's anybody that was a bad egg in the whole bunch, but there aren't bad eggs in our community.
Yeah. I mean,
why don't you tell us your least favorite episode?
Ooh.
Well, I don't have a specific least favorite, but I do have this phenomenon that happens occasionally, which is that, and this has only happened once so bad that I didn't put out the episode, but occasionally I'll talk to people and I'm not sure if it's that they're afraid to open up on the mic, or that they don't have, a solid idea of what their work is about. And so they keep referencing technique. Like it's like a circle. Like, I'll ask a question like, what does this symbol mean in the work? And they'll come back to talking about some technique that makes the symbol. And that is so frustrating. Because what I'm in it for as the interviewer is I want to talk about meaning. Like, technique is a vehicle to get to the meaning. But if I ask you about the meaning and we just go back to technique around and around and around and around, eventually it feels more like a how-to interview. And a lot of the interviews that I do have a how-to portion, but they don't necessarily, that's not the bigger, the bigger picture is like, what does this mean? So I thought we would actually transition to our second topic with Britta and Carole, which is that how do you feel like that making has given your life meaning? Even if it's a philosophical question, I wanted to see if you guys have the same sense of wordless enjoyment that you have with meaning. And what I mean by that is, like, I've been trying to figure this out for myself my whole life. Is like, why does creativity make me so happy? And why, when I'm not creative, do I get so unhappy? So I thought that we might talk about how you create meaning through making, and see if you guys have any thoughts on that. Either one of you can jump in.
Well, that's such a big topic. That's such a big topic that you just kind of dropped on us. But I mean, I think it's something specifically that I've been thinking about in the last couple of years since COVID and sort of shifting things in my practices, is that idea of where that creativity exists. And I sort of don't want to be that type of person that sees a difference between my art life and my regular life. Like, it all bleeds together, but there's definitely parts in my life where that creativity, like I'm like you, where it's like, if I'm not making, I'm miserable, but then I'm also miserable sometimes making, because creativity can be really hard. And it's not that thing that just flows from us constantly. And in the last couple of years, for some reason, I feel like I've tapped into something that's very akin to that feeling when you're 20 and you're in college and you've got that community around you and you stay up all night working on something and you forget to eat, and I kind of lost that for a time too. And I think that's something that's just been philosophically on my mind lately is those seasons of our lives, and we look at them and categorize them in terms of, like family, college, blah, blah, blah. But then as artists, what are those different stages of our lives? And I just spent a good chunk of time with two incredible women artists, and we talked a lot about like the crone age for women, and like all these different ages and how all of those fit in. And so, yeah, that's sort of just what been on my mind lately.
What age is the crone age? Is that a thing?
Be careful, Carole.
Did you guys
I'm going to be really well, and I'm somebody who got literally offered the seniors discount recently, like in the last couple of weeks. So I know to be careful with this. Judy says, "Hey, now." No, I mean, I think it's. I don't know what that is. I think, yeah, Jackie's saying it's more of a stage than an age, and I agree with that. And I think, for me, maybe I feel like I'm encroaching on that because of where my kids are at. Like, my kids are a very different age than your beautiful daughter, Ben. I've got a 10-year-old and a 14-year-old. And like, there's these ideas that like, I can see them leaving home and stuff and seeing all this shift into a different stage of my art practice where I can make full time again and I can do whatever I want at whatever time of day because there's no children involved. And so I feel like I'm on the precipice of that again and building up to that part of my life again. So maybe that's the crone stage. And I'm just going to be like, forget everything. It's all about me. And I'm just going to make what I want.
I think we got to rename the crone stage because it actually sounds like you've got freedom. Like you have freedom of time to be creative, either when your children move out or like I think about now, my creativity has to come in 2-hour chunks because my daughter is young enough that like I only got a 2-hour chunk.
You got 2 hours? I used to have 20 minutes when my kids were that age.
Well, some of that is that my wife is working very diligently and very hard. So I have to give her props for giving me 2 hours in a row sometimes. Awesome. But even when your child is 10, I think that, elongates. Hopefully it's going to elongate and I'll have more than 2 hours. I might have 3 hours that I could be creative in a row.
It does. Judy says queen stage. I like that.
The queen stage.
I love that.
Time to put your crown on.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by Amico Brent. For the past 100 years, Amico Brent has been creating ceramic supplies for our community ranging from underglazes to electric kilns, and they have no plans of slowing down. With over 3,000 products, Amico Brent's top priority is making sure that all of their customer needs are met. From the professional to the student and everyone in between, their high-quality materials enable you to make your best work. To learn more, check them out at amico.com or on Instagram and Facebook at Amico Brent. You can also show them how you use Amico by sharing your work online with the hashtag HowIAmico. Today's episode is brought to you by the Rosenfeld Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. The collection exists as an online resource for research and inspiration featuring photos of thousands of objects made by over 800 artists. The images are high quality and can be used with no permission required, making them a great resource for students and teachers. To find out more, visit rosenfeldcollection.com. Okay, so Britta, let's bring you into the conversation about meaning. How do you think making gives your life meaning?
Oh, I did not want you to ask me this because I feel like, it makes me really emotional. I don't know if I had the same very personal just meaning in my life before I started making. I definitely have meaning through my family, through my amazing husband and my kids and all of that. I love being a mom. I love all of these aspects, but everything I had done for work before was just a job. Everything I had done creatively was enjoyable, but I didn't feel like it was really part of me, except that clearly I needed to be creative somehow. And when I made my first really shitty pot, it's tiny, it's sharp, it's heavy. I don't know if I've ever been that excited about something that I made outside of my kids in my life. It was incredible. And I have this really, Ira Glass has that whole thing about, perfectionism and how it's really hard for creative people because we have really good taste and we want to meet that good taste right away. And it is hard. And I had dumped a lot of projects before because I wasn't good at it. And this one I didn't. I was not good at it. I tell my students all the time, I did not start with some magical talent. I was terrible at it, but it gave me something, and it still gives me something. And there are certainly times where it can get muted, the feeling of love for creativity and wanting to make. And there are times it can be ignited. I went through a really bad period last year where I had a hard time making because it wasn't bringing me joy, but there was no way I was really going to stop. Like, I knew that I was going to get out of that and that this was still my path. It sounds so cliche, but I just can't not make. I can't. And I hope that, as a functional potter, my goal is to sort of give that to other people and to put pots out into the world that other people can enjoy. And hopefully it can bring some meaning to them, even in the act of, drinking your coffee. I hope that somebody, using my pot has some personal connection to that, whether it's a past memory of theirs, whether it's that they know me. Yeah.
Now, I love that you're talking about how hard it is. I think that's why it gives my life meaning, actually, is because I started making pots in high school. So I was lucky that I went to a public high school in Virginia that taught me ceramics. I mean, that is super rare in 2022 that even happens. But in the late 90s, that was still happening in Virginia. And I was taught by a teacher who really kind of opened up. Julie Hamilton was her name. And Patty Pope is the other professor. And they taught me that art was really, really big. Like you could be a painter, you could be a drawer, you could be a potter in my case, you could do whatever, but it was so big. And it was like they took the veil off in front of my eyes. And this happened at 15. I basically got turned on early to what creativity could do. But those pots are horrible. Like I was back in Virginia recently, and I saw some of them, and it's not like that meaning comes from making a beautiful object. I think meaning comes from making maybe a personal object, like something that you have connected to either through your time, through your sweat equity, whatever it is, but they don't have to be beautiful. I mean, I actually don't even think, talking about perfectionism, you brought that up. I don't even think I have made a singular pot that I really think is transcendently beautiful in the way that Michael Simon's work is, or Clary Elian, or, I can keep naming all these artists that I've seen, Julia Galloway. I see those objects and they're so beautiful that they give my life meaning. But what's interesting is, as a maker, it's the process, like it's the structure of making that gives my life meaning. And I think, like you said, Britta, that the pandemic is like threw all that structure out the window, and I've really struggled too. The first 9 months of the pandemic, I didn't make hardly anything. I basically made enough to send things to shows, and that was it.
Yeah, I have a really hard time making if my mental space is not in a good place. But, I think it's probably your pots mean a lot to me. And they have given my life meaning, but I agree, mine don't necessarily make me feel that way. But the act of making it makes me feel like I have this meaning in life. And I'm so grateful for all the people that are supporting me and letting me continue to do this, like my husband. And there are some really ugly pots out there. My future brother-in-law just commented, and I know that he has some, he and my sister. I'd love to get those back.
They can trade up.
But, that act of creating something, it's incredible. I see it in my students' faces every time they get a pot back. It's wonderful.
I think there's something about potters though, and all artists sort of talk about that differently. Like some people really talk about making for themselves, but I think when we're making these functional objects, we're making them because we know somebody is going to use them. We constantly, different than a painting, we envision that audience and that interaction with them. And I think for me, like that's where all of that meaning is. And so that quest to make the perfect pot, like I don't think I'll make that perfect pot ever that I'll want to keep, because it's not about making something for myself where I can totally see myself reflected. It's somehow about that relationship with somebody else that goes, that person sees me and understands me. And I've also left something of myself permanently somewhere else in the world, right? I don't know.
I like this idea that we engage in a process that is meaningful, and then we give these objects full of our meaning to other people. And then they can take it on and maybe multiply it, hopefully, through serving out of it if it's a functional object, or talking to their family about it if it's an art piece. But somehow it's a cumulative meaning, and that I don't think that's that weird of an idea. I actually got this question by thinking about a professor I had in grad school at the University of Florida, and we were studying African textiles and trade routes in North Africa. Like how did Islam and commerce mean that all these fabrics got traded all around North Africa, but also people had religious experiences by converting to Islam and then having a relationship with the religion. And I was asking her, like, how do we get meaning? But she talked about that we get meaning through ritual and repetition. And that's how we do it. Like as human beings, we make objects, we trade objects in the case of these fabrics, but we employ these objects over and over through ritual life, and that meaning accumulates through the object. And I've never forgot that. And it was funny because it was not a clay class. It was an art history class about textiles. But I've just been so grateful that I got to talk to that lady about that.
Yeah, that makes me think about like moments where you look at historic archaeologically pulled pots, right? Like I was recently in Greece and got to look at shards and pots that, blew me away. But it was also about looking at things and seeing this make of a human hand. And even like on a lot of the traditional Greek works, there's all these just sort of like little swirls and stuff like that. And I'm like, yeah, I do that on my work too. Right. And it's this, I think it's that meaning comes in where it's just like the timeline also evaporates. Right. Where those elements of humanity that are imbued into those objects transcend time. And so it's like, I can look at a pot that was made 3,000 years ago and go, okay, I can see myself in it. Right. And so that meaning somehow hopefully gets into the work that you make, that you put out.
That idea of seeing yourself in historical pots is really an interesting idea. I think that I fell in love with museums maybe before I even fell in love with art. Being from Virginia, we would go to Colonial Williamsburg, and there was a lot of historical pots there that were from the colonial era. And even though the colonial time is very dubious, I mean, that was like tremendous injury was made to African Americans at that time, as well as indigenous people. Like it was a bad time. But those objects in the museum, like that was some of the first times that I was like, like, look at that earthenware plate. That is amazing. And that was 1790s probably.
But isn't it also cool to like look at those and go, and to be able to know the history of the turmoil of the world around the making of those, and then go back to your studio and think about your pot and think about like the last few years of the pandemic and everything that's happening in the world, and see how your pots will be seen in that same way?
I think so. And I wanted to ask you if you would be willing to talk about recent work that has been about the fall of Roe in the U.S. And
yeah, you just want to go real deep. Okay.
Well, but the question is not about how you feel necessarily about that, but how did you put the feeling into the pot? Because since that, the work you've been making about that Supreme Court decision as a Canadian, looking at American women having their rights taken away, like there's some emotional quality in the drawing that you've done on your pots recently that is just like a whole nother level. So what happened?
I don't know, but it's really exciting on some levels, but it's also, yeah. So that piece, I'm still painting the colors and stuff on it. And this is like the fourth piece that I've done in a different style that's actually combining the work that I was doing sculpturally and the surfaces and the more political intent with the functional pottery. So there's something that's like 20 years in the making that's coming together that's really exciting for me too. But then I think that piece in particular, and you messaged me shortly after I posted it, and you said something, and I really appreciated that, because it's different when somebody goes out of their way to message you rather than to just hit like and post a comment or whatever. But that piece was one of the first times that I think I'm so angry. I'm so angry about so many things. And I just let myself be really angry as I was making it, and let myself really pull my own narratives into it as well. And then the feeling too, I mean, there's a lot of people who are like, oh, okay, it's an American issue. It's not Canadian. And Canada's got not the same issues right now, but we're so close. We do have the same issues, and there's a lot of conservative talk in Canada, and there's a lot of people who would push for the exact same as what's happening in the US right now. And that piece was one of these things where I was just like, I don't live in a world where this happens anymore, right? And so it was like all that frustration. But for me, it's like, I think I'm finally in my 40s and it's the crone age where I'm just like, literally, fuck it. I don't need to impress anybody anymore. I just need to get this out of my system, because otherwise I can't go on to the next day. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And giving yourself permission. Like, I think about that a lot. Like, how do we give ourselves permission?
Yeah. I think that's one of the hardest things that I've had to learn as an artist, is to just give yourself permission, and to know that, and I'm totally working on it. I'll work on it till the end of days, but to just trust in your intuition as well, and allow that to sort of lead you through. And I don't think I ever did that with the drawing part before.
Yeah. Britta, can you relate to that idea of giving yourself permission? Like, not necessarily with subject matter, maybe it's with time, like giving yourself permission to dedicate yourself to making, or however you think about it.
Definitely with time. None of my pottery is really political or, about current events. It's, for me, that time is to make something that hopefully I find beautiful. I do use it as therapy a lot. If there are times where my mental space is not good enough to go into the studio, but there are a lot of times where being in the studio is a safe place for me. Making something feels grounding when the entire world feels, in upheaval. As far as giving myself permission, I definitely have to give myself permission for time. I became a stay-at-home mom when my oldest daughter was, she was only about 9 months old when we made that decision to move to Pennsylvania, and that I would stay home. And then we had another daughter, and I was a stay-at-home mom for, I think, 7 years before, I started doing pottery as a hobby. And that was a big thing, was giving myself permission to leave the house and do something outside of taking care of the kids. And that was definitely my feelings. My husband had no problem with me doing this, but it was something I had to tell myself was okay, because that had been my identity for a really long time, was the girl's mom. And I still have to do it now, because even though I am a full-time potter, my studio is here at home. So you have to give yourself permission to walk away from whatever else is going on, go downstairs and allow yourself to make, and to not feel bad about it, to not feel guilty about it, to know that that's a really important thing. And when things like Roe versus Wade being taken away happen, I really need that time. Otherwise, I do go into a really dark space. So I need to give myself permission to make beautiful things and have that time for myself.
Yeah, and the idea of identity is something that I've been thinking about in the way that I've been structuring the show. So when Zosha was born, I took a break and we did a series called Meet the Parents, and I had a lot of friends that thankfully stepped up, and it was husband and wife or couples, wife and wife interviewing each other. And it was very interesting because I could tell some of these topics they talked about, but I could see this exploration of parenting in the interviews that I got so much out of. And it's about identity. Like, how do you see yourself? In fact, I think Lindsay Ostrader talked about this in the interview, is like shifting senses of identity. So check that out if you guys haven't listened to those already. It's Meet the Parents. And then there was another series I did recently called More Than a Maker, and that was about mental health and creativity. And I think mental health is so much about understanding our identity and being comfortable with it, whatever it is. So I've liked lately that artists have let me engage them with questions about identity. And I'd say over the course of the podcast, that's getting more and more. Like, I'm more and more interested in how people see themselves, either as artists, parents, as American citizens, as citizens of the world, like whatever category you put yourself in, that self-reflection, I think, makes for some interesting episodes.
Well, when we were talking about favorite episodes, I was going to point out that my favorite theme was actually the most recent one, the mental health theme. I think that says something about you, that people trust you and were willing to talk to you. So you should take credit for that. I think you are a trusted person in the community. And, having all of these episodes does help with that, because people have heard you speak and how thoughtful you are. But I think it's really so important to talk about mental health. And I'm glad that a lot of different areas, in my life, I'm hearing that come up a lot more. It makes a huge difference, even just to have someone say, oh, my therapist said X, Y, Z. If you are also seeing a therapist, it immediately relaxes you to be like, oh, great, this is something we can talk about. I think it's ridiculous that there's a stigma around it. And the only way to change that is to keep talking.
Well, I think this is a good opportunity to open it up to the audience, because I realize I have way more questions for Carole and Britta, but there might be questions from the audience. And we have been going about an hour, so if people need to duck out at any time, feel free to do that. But I wanted to open it up and see if you guys have any questions for any of us, or observations if you have some.
I've got a trivia question for you, Ben. Well, maybe while people are putting questions in the thing. So I contacted some folks before this and just sort of said, if you've got stories about Ben or anything you want to say to Ben, to send them to me. So I have some emails that I'm going to forward to you. And most of it was just really lovely compliments and stuff. But I've got a story here, and I'm curious if you can remember who this is.
Oh, God.
Because I thought this was a funny story. So I'm going to try and read this story without giving away too much of who it was. There's definitely some clues that I have to jump over. So the situation is that you were in a critique, and you showed a series of cups that you explained were inspired by the colors and textures of family heirloom quilts. This person remembers picking one up and saying that they were especially drawn to it because the colors reminded them of their favorite My Little Pony toy.
I know who this is.
You know who this is. In a very level voice, Ben responded to my comment by handing me the mug and saying, "Thank you for sharing that. You may have this mug because I will definitely not be using those colors together again."
Was that Magda?
That was Magda, yes.
Yes, Magda Glushek. We were in grad school together. And do you ever just have instincts that are so personal that you don't reflect on them? Like the color combination of teal and pink. Like that was one of those things where I was like, that's a nice glaze. That's a nice glaze. Let's put them together. And the minute she said My Little Pony, it like crushed my soul a little bit. Like I died a little bit in that moment, because not that I think My Little Pony is bad. It's that I was thinking that those colors meant historical pottery. And she was like, they mean My Little Pony. So it was, that was a defining moment in grad school.
That's interesting. Because I feel like, that'd be something I would just run with. I'd be like, My Little Pony.
Yeah.
This is perfect.
So Ben is not a brony. And if you don't know what that is, it is men who love My Little Pony.
Oh, yeah. That is not
brony.
me.
Well, Ben, you also have a daughter, so you still have potential to become a brony.
Yeah. There will be some version of My Little Pony for her age. I don't know like what it is now, but
There is. And
it's still My
really
Little
funny.
Pony.
Yeah, what is it now, Britta?
No, there's still My Little Pony, but I have to tell you, it's quite clever after watching it with my girls when they were young. Yeah.
Cool. So people have some comments. So Cole said he wanted to thank us for being honest and vulnerable about the struggles within the making and creative process, which I agree. I feel like this is a conversation. I mean, I think this would be a great show at Ensika if we showed the not good work for the sole purpose of the people coming up through undergrad and grad and any, from wherever, that they would say like, oh yeah, we don't all have to make great objects. Sometimes you can learn a lot. Maybe the show would be like your best failure and you show some object that you learned a ton from.
And we all have to go to our parents' kitchen cupboards to get it, right? Like that's where those pieces exist, right?
And maybe we could even let our loved ones pick the pot out. That would be good.
I think just like, I was saying with hearing that somebody else is in therapy or that they have mental health struggles, I think it's really important to talk about the failures in our process, especially the further on we get. So, I'm not that far on. I'm 11 plus years in, but I'm much further along than my students. They need to know that I still have really crappy days, that there are days where I just can't center anything, or I flopped 3 pots in a row and it's something I make all the time, or I make a design choice and it does not work. I think that's a really important thing to share. I do see it a lot on Instagram, which I appreciate.
Yeah, ceramic casualties. That's a great hashtag. You guys should.
I love that hashtag. And I agree with you. Like sharing that stuff is so important for everybody else to see. Everybody needs to see that when they're slip casting, the entire bucket can go all over the floor. Like we all need that. But then I always feel like whenever I post something like that, because I want to share that I have those limits in my life too. But then it's like this like pity fest. And I'm like, I don't need the pity. I don't know. I know it sucks, but yeah. But that's also another sign of how great our community is that everybody does relate and everybody wants to tell you that it's okay.
Recently, I demoed for my students. We were talking about flower bricks. And so I said, okay, well, let's just make some. We looked at a bunch of pictures and I said, okay, we're going to make these. I've only made a couple. So, little blind leading the blind. I made some of them were so ugly. We were just laughing hysterically. And I think it's really good for, my students and maybe another potter to see that sometimes you just make really ugly stuff and it's all right. You're all learning. There's still, you can keep growing in this, which also I think is a great thing about pottery is you can always have something to learn.
And Cole came up with a good name for this show, The Best of the B-Sides, which is good because they used to have the B-Sides of albums, which were good. They weren't as good as the A-side, but they were okay.
I think it should be a competition though, too, because generally speaking, like people probably don't match those first pots. Like if it was just a disaster pot, that's one thing. But if it was like one of your earlier pots, like, I don't know if I'd recognize who it was. Have it be a contest.
So Jackie has a question about how do you process the vulnerability of putting your story or voice on your work? So I think that's a question about the internal landscape. Like how do you... It's one thing to draw something on a pot. It's another thing to feel something while you're drawing on the pot. So how do you guys think about that? And maybe you, Carole, because you were sharing about that earlier.
Well, I mean, vulnerability is something that I've been trying to figure out my entire career in art. When I first started in my undergrad and having this desire to make more social commentary or political based work, I would dive into the topics, but then really keep myself removed from them because I didn't want it to be about me. And then over time, it's like, I had a great friend. I've talked about Leah Tysoner so many times, but she said to me at one point, she's like, if you're not in the work, then there's no way for anybody else to be in the work. You have to put something of yourself in the work in order for other people to resonate with it. And I found over time, rather than hiding and going, no, I want you to pay attention to Roe versus Wade. I want you to pay attention to these issues. It's like, no, I want you to see my frustration. I want you to see a human behind it. And so that vulnerability has been something that, yeah, like I'm really, really working on it. But then I also think like there's a lot of things that I don't put in my work, or that I slightly touch on in my work, and that some people I know see in my work, and that a lot of people don't see, where I'm like, I'm trying to be vulnerable, but I also still have those expectations of like, okay, I don't want to say this in front of, who this person or that person or whatever. Right. And so vulnerability it's difficult to figure out, but I feel like I actually put a post on Instagram the other day and then like promptly took it away. But I was asking the question. I'm not the only one that does that, right? I'm sure everybody does that. But I put a post in my stories, and it was asking about like what people's biggest fear is when they're in the studio making. And I put my response is like, what my biggest fear is that I will make things that people can't relate to. Right? And so it's always about somebody seeing the world the way I do. And so the more I can I don't want it to just be surface. I don't want it to just be that like conversation about the weather. I want it to be that conversation about like mental health and getting deep into it. And not just like, oh, we both see a therapist. That's great. But it's just like, what's working for you? Let's get deeper, deeper, deeper all the time. But it's hard to do that because it's a trust issue and stuff too.
Yeah, vulnerability is tricky because I've found, like there's a term oversharing for a reason. Like there are times in which sharing the wrong thing at the wrong time is what makes it weird, not what you're sharing, And I think early in my own sort of path in mental health, I think I was probably oversharing a lot because I didn't necessarily know when to pick the right time that the other person was emotionally available. So I think for me, this question about vulnerability, I don't share the vulnerability through my work as much, but I do share the vulnerability more and more on the podcast. And I think I've come to cherish that, that people are willing to go there with me, and I think about the episode with Mac McCusker. We were talking about, just kind of when mental health has hard consequences around addiction. And we were sharing, some personal history about that. And the feeling I got after talking to them, it was so, the vulnerability in that was so comforting because it's that feeling of I'm not alone, And I think that's what you're saying, Carole, is like when you can relate to someone else, it's like one of the greatest gifts in the world. And the podcast has allowed me to do that over and over and over.
But it's allowed all of us to do it, Ben. That's why it's so amazing. It's allowed all of us to be, you take us all along on that ride, right? Like Mac's episode I just listened to too. And I've known Mac for years. And the story about like the police officer and the ID. I mean, that's when Mac first told me that story, it stuck with me, and it's stuck with me for years, right? And you're bringing so much more than just ideas about creativity and clay. You're bringing so much about humanity to the forefront within that. And I mean, to do that, you've had to be vulnerable, and you've had to put yourself out there too, and maybe not specifically about what it is that's happened in your life and all that kind of stuff, but really just sort of allowing that space and offering that up for the community.
Yeah. I mean, what a gift that Mac was willing to sit down and do the episode, and the other folks. I mean, that whole series. And I'm thinking about making that series on mental health a recurring series, like maybe do it every 2 years or so, because I do think it's an issue that a lot of people are dealing with. Mm-hmm. So we have wrapped up our evening. There are some more questions, so I'm sorry we didn't get to the questions that are in the chat, but I don't want to go on too long. But I did want to take a minute and just thank all of you, because one of the things about doing a podcast is that it can be speaking into the void, and Carole and I used to talk about this with blogging, because actually before I had a podcast, this Tales of a Red Clay Rambler was a blog. And one of the things Carole and I talked about is when we're blogging, are we just yelling into the void? Like, is anyone there? But one of the things that I want to thank you guys for is that I know that people are listening, and people send me messages and send me emails, and that feeling, that dialogue that can come from this, like that's what you guys give me. So I just want to thank you all for tuning into this episode as well as all the others. So thank you all for coming. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you.
you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.
We respectfully acknowledge and honor all Indigenous communities whose lands we reside on in the United States, and recognize that we are uninvited guests on the occupied, unceded, and ancestral lands of over 500 nations indigenous to North America. By acknowledging and reflecting upon the contemporary lived experiences and histories of the Indigenous peoples here and globally, we may begin to take essential steps towards creating a more equitable world. Learn more through the hashtag Honor Native Land initiative of the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture, and consider contributing to Indigenous-led organizations doing important work to further health and wellness, sovereignty, and self-determination of the first people of the lands you reside. This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.